the closest that we've come to real significant legalization of unionism in the public sector. This moment has come and been vetoed. And now we find ourselves in disarray and retreat, figuring, is it possible? All of us in the labor movement should have known that by electing this woman, or even going along with her election, that this would end up in some form or fashion being the result of it.
Welcome to Fight Back Radio, a production of fightbacknews.org, taking you to the heart of the people's struggle. I'm your host, Richard Berg, and today our episode is going to discuss labor unions, and electoral politics. And this has been a tricky question for some unions over the years. Some have made some bad mistakes, but also there's been some really good things done about that as well. Before I get into the episode and our guests, though, I do want to, we lost one of the great fighters of the last century recently, this past weekend, B. Lumpkin. And I want to dedicate this episode of Fight Back Radio to B. Lumpkin, who was a delegate for the Chicago Federation of Labor. And even at the time of her death, at age 107, that's not a mistake, 107, she was still a retiree delegate to the Chicago Teachers Union, which is my union. And I'll tell you, I was both, I served on both those bodies with B. And she was, even at 104, 107, she was an active delegate. She had opinions about things, and she was going to let you know. And truth be told, her opinions were usually right. She also, I learned recently, served on Frank Chapman's defense committee, which helped get him out of jail. She was the author of several books, but two that I'm aware of. One is called Joy in the Struggle, which is her autobiography, and another called Always Bring a Crowd, which is a story of her husband, Frank Lumpkin, who was a steel worker and was active actually here in Chicago in the Labor Party effort that we're going to be talking about today. She's the last, I think, of a generation of communists who brought Marxism, Leninism, and that understanding to the trade union fights of the 30s, 40s, and 50s. She fought fascism wherever she saw it for her entire life, including in the time of Hitler and Mussolini. And she lived through McCarthyism and emerged on the other side of that, dedicated to the communist cause. We're going to dearly miss her, and so we dedicate this episode to B. Lumpkin. Having said that, our guest today is Chris Townsend, who's, I think, uniquely qualified to talk about electoral politics in the United States from the labor trade union perspective. Chris has been a union member for 47 years. He was recently with the Amalgamated Transit Union and was the International Union Organizing Director. Previously, he had been the International Representative and Political Action Director for the United Electric Workers Union, and he held local positions in both SEIU, Service Employees International Union, and the UFCW, the United Food and Commercial Workers Union. Chris and I were talking just before we hit record here, and I think I met Chris in the mid-1990s when we were doing this effort to try to, and we did, in fact, form a labor party here in the United States, and I hope that we can talk about that a little bit. It's a pleasure to have you on Fight Back Radio, Chris. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks. My favorite show.
All right.
And not just because you have me on once in a while. I do appreciate your interviews. Good work.
Okay, well, thank you. And I appreciate your writings, and we'll refer to some of them and tell people how they can find you as we do the interview here. But I want to start out with, you live in Virginia, and your governor, Abigail Spanberger, has become quite controversial. This is a Democratic governor in a state that's been Republican for some time. And I think she's a good example of some of the problems we see in electoral politics today, as we fight union busting Republicans, and some of the Democrats we get in aren't all there. So I'm hoping you could tell our Fight Back Radio listeners a little bit about who is Abigail Spanberger, and talk a little bit about her run for governor and, how that played out and how she became governor of Virginia. And then, from there, maybe we can dig into a little bit of some of the things she's done as governor.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I live here in Alexandria, Virginia, Northern Virginia, the fringes of Washington, D.C. And I've been here since UE sent me down here in 1992 to be the political action director for UE. And I want to preface, when you deal with subjects, political action, legislative affairs, and all this, I always want to say there was a UE truism that I was bathed in my time as a UE member and field staff member organizer. But when I became the Washington representative, or as we used to call it in UE, I took it to heart. And it was this: if you're a trade unionist, certainly if you're a left-wing trade unionist, which I know we sure are, you got to know the difference between political action and playing politics. It's not just a trite little observation. What we see today going on is a monstrous malpractice, very little political action, tremendous amount of playing politics, and even worse. And look at the condition of the labor movement and the working class more broadly. So let's get to the question of Abigail Spanberger. This is a woman who joined the CIA at the peak of George W. Bush's popularity. Now, I don't know about you, Richard, or any of the listeners, but I had no urge to join the CIA and torture people and create false flag operations and massacre trade unionists and left. No, that's not what I was ever about, but she was. She joined, voluntarily was there for 12 years, got out, as is the case with all of this riffraff that floats around. We are never privy to have any information of what exactly she did or why she stayed, why she left. That's national security. You're not allowed to know this. Well, she was only out of the CIA a short time, and the conservative reactionary elements in the upper echelons of the Democratic Party saw this woman as really a great opportunity in a female rapper and a national security rapper. And of course, saying we need to get somebody into the pipeline in Virginia, ultimately to take the Senate seat of either Mark Warner or Tim Kaine. So it was a well put together program, goes back more than a decade, and they first ran her for a House seat. And everyone who follows politics in the United States probably knows that Virginia is sort of steadily moving from Republican to Democrat. But of course, what kind of Democrats, So they shoehorn her in as a member of the House. And, I should say in the House, her best friend was Barbara Comstock, who prior to MAGA, we would have just dismissed as a lunatic, but only because of MAGA, somewhat like Liz Cheney, somewhat seems reasonable. But this was her friend. Anyway, she had 3 terms in the House, and then they set up Abigail Spanberger to be Virginia governor. And there was no other serious candidate. This was an insider operation to get her in there. The labor movement was here in Virginia and nationally, the AFL-CIO, completely asleep and probably not seeing any problem with her. I seem to be, and, I've written about this saga of Spanberger going back, well into last year. And there just seems to be no recognition that the fact that she came from the CIA alone should be a disqualifier in terms of, somehow being anyone that we would think about as supporting working people or workers, unions, least of all. Let's say one thing. I don't know how many folks just like you and me, Richard, have been massacred by the CIA over decades. I mean,
yeah, lots,
countless, in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions. So anyway, put that aside for a second. We find ourselves with Abigail Spanberger as our governor. And, we also found ourselves last November in an election wave where there was a big backlash in the state of Virginia against the broad Trumpism for good reason. Firing tens of thousands of people using Elon Musk. What a deranged, mentally ill individual, firing these people, no notice even. All of the, I could go on. We could run a whole series of programs about the corruptions of Trump and the misleadership.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, she manages to slip back into office with a decent margin of victory because of that wave. And then, of course, we had last year's session of the legislation, or last year's session of the legislature. It produced legislature which was 80 years overdue, which would have, among other things, legalized unionism and collective bargaining for our public sector. And for reasons, my conscience is clear. I've been ringing the alarm about this woman from day one within the labor movement. But anyway, it turns out that by the time that legislature got to her desk just a few months ago, she vetoed it. And the labor movement runs around holding its rear end, thinking that they were betrayed. I'm not sure how you can consider this a betrayal. This I have predicted from day one. When you elect a CIA agent and someone who's essentially a Republican anyway. And, I got to mention this. This is too good to pass up. She played a minor role in the No Kings movement. She appeared at a couple of things. Well, let's get it on the record. When the real king from England came just a few months ago, King, whatever his name is, Richard.
Charles.
King Charles. Yeah, I don't even pay attention to it. Sorry. But anyway, he came. If anyone follows this, I've written about this too. He gave a perfectly despicable address to Congress, essentially bolstering Trump in every living way for his own reasons. But he then toured the countryside to meet with some of the peasantry. And she was his chaperone. So I just found that extremely ironic that, even this level of political thinking, why would anyone want to celebrate this king, a family line that should have been wiped out hundreds of years ago and modernized for the people of that country? But no, Abigail Spanberger takes him by the hand and rubs it in almost. And, so anyway, we find ourselves, Richard, here in state of Virginia with the closest that we've come to real significant legalization of unionism in the public sector. There's other things like right to work and other things yet to be done. But this moment has come and been vetoed. And now we find ourselves in disarray and retreat, figuring, is it possible to somehow push this through in the coming sessions of the legislature? She's limited, thankfully, to one term. And then she will run for the Senate, as I laid out. But this is just a disgraceful and sad moment. And I don't blame Spanberger in the sense that all of us in the labor movement, who are adults at least, should have known that by electing this woman, or even going along with her election, that this would end up in some form or fashion being the result of it.
Yeah. I think, so Spanberger is a microcosm of, what the labor movement's doing pretty much all over the country. And we just had the AFL-CIO, which is, for those that don't know, is the American Federation of Labor Congress of Industrial Organization, and the umbrella for almost every union in the country, had their national convention in Minneapolis just 2 weeks ago, I think now. And a lot of what they talked about was the midterm elections, and and their view of that the Democrats, kind of an uncritical view that getting a Democrat in is equal to being good for labor. And you just told us about Spanberger and how that wasn't whatever it was no different or hardly different, I should say, than a Republican. So how should we look at the Democratic Party in your view? And, what should the AFL-CIO be doing in terms of political action to start to actually have some scrutiny and as you said, political action as opposed to just political maneuvering? I forgot how you said it exactly.
Yeah, no, we need political action, not playing politics. And that seems somewhat flippant, but no, think about it. I mean, we have too much playing politics, too much wheeling and dealing, horse trading, all these things that even a beginner shop steward will be taught not to conduct themselves this way. Stick to principles, stick to facts, stick to reality. But we allow that to dissipate when it comes to our political work too often. And I'll say, what we have to do, Virginia is a canary in a coal mine. We have a national Democratic Party that is marinated in anti-unionism and, saturated with money from some of the most filthy corporate and international, sources, that then somehow needs to somehow go out and still rally some sections of the working class. Because what I think all of us will concede is that huge numbers of working class people have supported and still support MAGA and Trump and the worst elements very much against their own self-interest, but that's not the way they see it. And I remind Democrats here in Virginia, if you look at the public opinion polls, which have some basis in fact, the political party with lower standings in the eyes of the broad public is the Democrats. As low and as bad as the current Republican Party may be, the Democrats frequently score even lower. Because this has been decade upon decade of promises, unmet promises, betrayals, craziness, job loss. We could go on forever about sort of the disastrous track record of the National Democratic Party. But yet, because of this thoroughly corrupt system that we're stuck in, they're the only opposition party allowed on the ballot. So we have Republicans and Democrats. So labor finds itself trapped in this two-party straitjacket, at least for the time being. And it means that we need to have a very different way of dealing with them. And I think while I'm very proud of the fact that I continue to speak out loudly and factually about what's going on with Spanberger and what her real purpose is, I find most of the labor movement sort of still confused, most of the liberals still confused, hoping against hope that somehow she'll do something. And this is really an additional problem that we have. We have to look at the reality. I mean, I'll digress for a second about why Spanberger exists. It was ultimately as first a member of Congress, then governor, and that'll be one term. So in 3 years, she'll be out, and then she will run for Senate. I'll bet my bankroll on this. And the two senators that we have in Virginia, let's look at these two real gems. Mark Warner, multimillionaire anti-union bigot, has single-handedly stood in the way of labor law reform at the national level for years now, years and years. This guy is bad business when it comes to workers. He's now teamed up with Tim Kaine. Now, Tim Kaine works a little harder to present his own image as sort of more of a man of the people. He has some religious, social work type aspects. Well, he doesn't tell you this, but you can look it up. He sits on the board of the so-called National Endowment for Democracy, which is one of the filthiest counter-revolutionary, it works hand in hand with the CIA and all this. So these are the two figures that we're stuck with. Mark Warner will tell you that he hates unions. Tim Kaine will yak, and then not do anything about it. But they, the ruling elites want to replace one of them. It'll probably be Warner with someone like Spanberger. Well, I don't know how Chris Townsend, with only a 12th grade in education, can somehow do this homework and discover this and then find, again, through wide layers of the labor movement and the Democratic Party, that people are surprised. So do your damn homework. That's what I say to people. Do your damn homework. I mean, listen to your 8th grade teacher, or whatever teacher you could recall yelling that at you, because these are facts. And for us to continue to avoid the facts, engage in idealistic, daydreaming, hopefulness, fine. Save that for Sunday morning if you're religious. Go to church. Pray all you want. But don't play that game in political action. You'll get burnt like we've been burnt seriously here in Virginia.
Yeah. I mean, it seems though, there's some hope in spots, like here in Chicago, we had, I'm very supportive of my union brother, who's now the mayor, Brandon Johnson, who's been attacked ferociously, by the way, by the developers and the rich. And there's some other spots I think you can, depending on where you are, you can point to, locally or in Congress or whatever. But trying to get, to say, okay, how do we get from here to there, or even get to a point where we can have some breathing space or make some gains, it seems like a tough project. And I mean, many things have been tried and more have failed than succeeded, I think. So in your view, what does political action actually look like, to use the word that you did, about what we need to do?
Well, I feel sometimes like I'm virtually alone in this, but everything I see and have learned over going on 50 years has taught me this, which is we have a primary crisis in the labor movement, and then we have many sub-crises. The primary crisis is we're not organizing. We've lost the loyalty of many of our own members. We've lost the loyalty of the broad working class. We represent less than 10%. We continue to shrink and dwindle across all measures. And this is the primary crisis. And that's why I've dedicated my life primarily to organizing the unorganized, bringing in reinforcements, bringing in new blood, because that blood is not just necessary for the dues revenue, it's primarily necessary for revitalizing the internal structures and the internal politics and leadership change within these unions. And this is something that, I would say to your mayor, Mamdani in New York, we're going to have a left-tinged mayor here in Washington, D.C., Janice Lewis George. These folks have to, I'm not the one to do it. None of them are going to talk to me, but it's not enough to just feel our pain and recognize the realities of the working class. We need these mayors, when they get elected, to actually stimulate the unions, call out the unions, to get them off their dead asses, to spend some of their vast treasuries that are piled up to the ceiling and get out and begin to organize the unorganized en masse. I will say, in all of my decades of organizing, I see today, believe it or not, as a very opportune moment for new union organizing. What I, however, also find, certainly it's the case where I live here in the Middle Atlantic in the East, a labor movement virtually in a coma in terms of any outward looking or willingness to organize. So we find ourselves with people all over the place. We all know that Liz Schuler, the head of the AFL-CIO, always likes to wrap herself around this notion that says that, big majorities of people say that they would join a union if they had the chance. Well, what the hell is the labor movement doing to provide that chance and provide that leadership? Where is the mass campaigns of organization? There's nothing. There's nothing. It's laughable. It's tragicomic when you look at it. So I say our political action needs to bolster this. And I give Bernie Sanders kudos for this. People wouldn't know this. UE was the first national union that embraced Bernie Sanders very, very early in his career. And in part, we did because Bernie Sanders saw his role in the state as someone to shepherd resources, organizing contacts, real support. He, over and over and over again, as UE was rebuilding its ranks in the state of Vermont, Bernie would come to meetings and tell people, vote for that union. If I worked there, I would vote for this union. He would call the employer, push back against union busting. He did affirmative things that all these elected folks could do, and most won't, or don't even have the imagination to think about them. So we were able to rebuild and eventually revive as a national union. That was the kind of political action and political help that the members really responded to, because that doesn't happen by your average Democrat. That just does not happen. I can't get involved in that. I don't get involved in, labor management matters. I'm rooting for you. I hear you. But, and of course, now we have a Spanberger here in Virginia who, pokes us in the eye. So labor has to rethink its entire political action program, if it even has one.
Yeah, no, that's right. Well, let me ask you this. I'll play a little devil's advocate here. I know I heard some of this back in the day when we were doing the Labor Party stuff in the 90s, and I've seen it especially with the building trades where they feel this, we need to, we need to find people that'll vote for us on this or that specific thing, and they tail around behind. But the trades, the issue it's jobs. It's always jobs with the trades, I think, and so they want so they team up, and they'll tell you we're in partnership with these developers, who are the bosses. We're in partnership with the bosses, and we need to have more development, more tax increment financing money go to development, or more public, public stuff needs to be done union. So it takes away from this view of that there's the bosses have an interest and the workers have an interest, and says that we have a common interest in the case of the trades and development, and they even go so far as to say we need we want pro-union Republicans, or that sort of thing. Maybe that's dying out now, but I think that was the George Bush type that would vote for. Maybe they owned a construction company and they were a Republican, but they wanted their construction company to get a job or something like that. And then I'll use another example here too. In Wisconsin, when Act 10 passed and collective bargaining was completely gutted out, you think, well, the Democrats weren't very dynamic in Wisconsin at that time. And I remember, they came to Illinois, and I was there when they went back to Madison, Wisconsin, the capital, to try to, they were trying to prevent a quorum from happening. But their speeches were weak, and I thought, oh my God, no wonder they're getting their butt kicked. But one or two more Democrats might have made a difference. So this is the argument. Even one or two weak Democrats, that could have voted to protect collective bargaining in Wisconsin. And so, these examples of the trades are Wisconsin, where, having somebody that supports us at least a little bit can make a big difference in a lot of lives of a lot of people. How do you answer things like that?
You're indicting in a very diplomatic way. You're indicting the labor leadership and the Democratic Party leadership, but let's put the finger on it. As long as the labor leadership of the country, such as it is, and it's a mixed bag and there's not a lot of it, but what's there, as long as its political action goals are timid, or they would say realistic, or it's hat in hand, very on bended knee, please, can we have this? Please, will you give us this? As long as we have that, what this leadership isn't capable of thinking through is that it doesn't force any Democrat to exceed that. And in fact, the Democrats would like to stay 4 or 5 paces behind where the union leadership is. So we find ourselves with nonsensical demands that are, this piece of legislation that's been floated through Congress, they got a few Republican votes about mandatory first contracts. It's a good idea, but read the bill. Nobody's going to want any of these contracts that are going to be generated should, in the unlikely event that particular legislation passes, because it's not designed to respond to unions. The whole thing was set up to be sort of a stalking horse for the bipartisan god. But anyway, the piece that I'll come back to the AFL-CIO, and even the AFL-CIO and the unions themselves. I don't want to single out the AFL. Remember, it is sort of a sum of its parts. And I also should say to folks, the AFL-CIO only represents about 68% of the organized workforce in the United States. It's certainly significant. It's a majority, but it's not everyone. There's numerous unions outside of the AFL-CIO, including one that I retired from, UE. But anyway, when we go out and speak to the working class today, if any of the listeners want to try this today, you'll find that you'll hear all kinds of workers will articulate, 101 dire problems that they're dealing with. But one of them that never comes out of the mouth of a labor leader today, never comes out of the mouth of a Democrat, is do we have a wage policy? Do we have something to drive up wages finally? Now you have folks like Spanberger with these fuzzy affordability. What do you mean affordability? We need a raise. People need a raise. Where are the trade unions? The trade unions will sit there and say, well, we can't bargain again until our next contract. Well, demand a reopener. We have people sitting in back rooms trying to figure out a general strike 2 years from now. What are we doing today about the wage problem? The inflation is eating people alive. Our members are seeing their already 2-week pay envelopes eroded by the day. And look, if we confine our discussions to the trade union membership, we'll see the most fortunate victims of this go out and speak to the unorganized who are being robbed wholesale on this. And no one at the AFL convent, nothing. This was never even an issue. Where's the wage policy? Where are we rallying people to go to these employers and force these employers to pay? It's not even on the radar. So I look at this and I say, what kind of a low point have we reached in our political action program, even our goals, even our daydreaming about what we want? We'll even have folks still timidly raise their hand and say, can we raise the minimum wage? Get out of here with your minimum wage. We need far larger than this. We need bigger enchiladas than that. You're not going to motivate very many people in the labor movement. So again, that's a good example where the labor movement throws the low-hanging fruit to the Democrat, and they'll say, well, I supported the increase in the minimum wage, even though very few members of the labor movement earn the minimum wage. And that's a whole sticky wicket there. But I just think that I've never seen in 47 years, I've never seen labor's political action as badly broken as it is and as irrelevant as it is. And in times, it ends up opening us up to real disasters like what we've just experienced here in Virginia. This is a disaster. This was maybe our only chance to be able to organize up to 500,000 people in this historically anti-union right-to-work state. And it was squandered by a really degenerate Democrat that we should have known about. We should have, let's accept responsibility for that. This was our fault.
Yeah. I want to circle back to this bill that you alluded to that just passed through Congress, and it basically it says that it speeds up getting a first contract, and for people that are not involved in labor, or even if they are, they may not know this piece of it. Organizing the unorganized, even under the best of circumstances, is hard work, and maybe that's why people don't do it. But after you've succeeded and you've gotten recognition from the National Labor Relations Board or whoever and certified, often the employer will stall for a year and then try to decertify you. And so that's what this was meant to try to deal with. And some of so labor put a lot of effort into getting this passed through the House. It may get killed in the Senate by filibuster anyways, but my understanding of it is that it goes to arbitration if they can't get an agreement, which is a so-called neutral person. But I want to talk to you. I will ask you about that, and then the other piece I wanted to ask you about is that there's a section of labor that said, we should, and I'm thinking of the Teamsters primarily, that said we need to reach out and get some Republican votes and get these guys to support us as well. Sean O'Brien famously spoke at the Republican National Convention, who just got reelected, by the way, unopposed, or his opponent failed to get nominated. So the Teamsters were saying, well, we can get Republicans that are pro-labor, I guess is what the idea is. And they got like 20 votes in the House on this or something like that. Can you respond a little bit to some of the weaknesses of the bill and of that strategy?
Sure. The bill itself has some grain of logic behind it, of course. And it's intoxicant. It's an intoxicant because ultimately, who are these arbitrators going to be? And what is the yardstick that they're going to use to decide what is a fair settlement? And what I think everyone is, and I've studied this bill a lot, and I followed its movement through Congress, which it did pass with some Republican support. Let me tell you, newsflash to everybody listening to this, there wasn't a single Republican who voted for this that actually thought it was going to pass the Senate and turn into something. And even if they did, they were well aware that this wasn't going to break the bank anywhere. And what we could end up with here inadvertently is sort of almost a company union type of inducement. Now, I'm going to say the problem with negotiating first contracts is real and it's dire. The listeners may not know this, but start with NLRB elections, of all of the NLRB elections that are won by whatever union in the course of a year, at best, 57% of them will get first contracts. Now, as you point out, Richard, the resistance that we are up against is illegal, pervasive, terroristic. That explains a lot of why we can't get first contracts. But let me explain something, folks. Go out and any of you who've been through a first contract campaign, I'm going to tell you that the level of incompetence in many unions or the abject laziness in terms of addressing the first contract campaign explains a large number of those contracts. I could take people by the hand around Washington, D.C., give you half a dozen examples where workers were ready to move, organized, and whatever union they joined dropped the ball, failed utterly, embarrassingly to even attempt seriously to get a first contract. And then they blame the boss. So I think, this segues to the bill. Let's not blame the employers for unions that don't want to do their work, don't want to do their job, don't want to lead the workers in struggle. Let's get that on the record. But secondarily, this is a piece of legislation. I could see a version of this that we would enthusiastically support, not this version. And for Sean O'Brien to run stand on high, like somehow this is some goal, bipartisanship. No, the goal of the labor movement shouldn't be to find the handful of otherwise deranged individuals in the Republican Party who might opportunistically vote for a piece of vote. Our mission needs to be to obliterate these people from the political scene. That's our goal. And we're not going to do that by pandering to them, because think about it. Every single one, I think there were about 14 votes, 12 or 14 Republicans that supported that bill. We can hear all of them now on the campaign trail throwing that in the face. Don't call me anti-union. I voted for this legislation. That was the entire purpose of this vote that they cast, to give somebody a fig leaf to hide behind. And instead, what we need to do is examine their records, examine their anti-union core, which every one of them have, and then through political action, obliterate this person, remove them from office, replace them hopefully with a far better pro-worker advocate. So I see this. I mean, this was almost fantastic to watch. Another new low, and the members, the sad fact is, Richard, that many of the members are taken in by this, for whatever reason. One of the things I've been an advocate of, and I've written about it, and I've talked to, national and international union leaders, including the current president of the Amalgamated Transit Union. What are we doing to educate our members to the realities and facts of life of today's environment for trade unionists and the broader working class? You know what the answer is, comrades, listeners? Almost nothing. We're doing almost nothing to educate our members. And I mean, seriously, some left groups, your show, Fight Back News, the writing that I do, we try. But this is a drop in the bucket of what the trade unions could do, but they don't want to do it. Because again, as long as you're harboring some seriously deranged delusion that there's some version of bipartisanship out there or reaching across the aisle, these people these are sick individuals that we're dealing with in MAGA and the Republic. I mean, I don't know. Why do we tiptoe around that? You don't. I don't. These are people that would shove guys like you and me, Richard, into the oven. Yeah. That's where it's headed. That's where it's headed. So I don't have any urge in the morning when I get up to somehow have, fellowship with this. These people need to be removed. But we have to do our work. It's not going to happen accidentally. It's not going to be a fluke. I mean, and this is really where I will say the caliber of the labor leadership today, in my estimation, is lower than I've ever seen it. And I'm not expecting perfection. I'm mortal myself, right? I have to hold myself to that standard. But this is appalling that we still have somebody trying to peddle that in 2026.
Yeah. I want to go back to 30 years here to when I first met you around that time, maybe more than 30 years ago, because I know you were involved. I want to talk about the Labor Party, but the Labor Party advocates, which preceded that, you were involved in that as well. And so there was a number of labor leaders, Tony Mazzocchi, probably the most prominent, and was the face of this movement during that time, from the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union, which is now through mergers into the paper workers, and then now the steel workers. But all others too. I mean, my union, Teamsters Local 743, was in trusteeship, and Eddie Cornegay we were a large local of about 20,000 members, was involved in this. Your union, the United Electrical Workers, was on the ground floor and heavily involved in it. And here in Chicago, I worked closely with Frank Rosen at that time, who was a strong advocate for the Labor Party. And looking back, in fact, right now we're marking 30 years since the founding of the party in Cleveland. The time leading up to that, and then after the party was founded, I was wondering, you were at the center of this. You wrote a column for their newspaper. I'm trying to remember. I want to say it was called Capitol Hill Shop Steward. Yeah, I like that. I remember reading it before I met you, and I thought, I like this one. But and you were working on Capitol Hill, so you were, boy, that was a tough job. But yeah, can you? I want to hear a little bit about what you thought of the labor leaders that were involved in that, and what they were trying to do. Was this a strategy? What did we learn from this? What was?
There was just a commemoration of, I guess it would have been the centennial of Tony Mazzocchi's birth, just a few weeks ago in New Jersey. I didn't attend, but I was glad they had it, and it'll publicize, his storied career, which this was a big piece of it. But, UE always was and still is a union that promotes political independence from these parties, period. Not in a mercenary way or a transactional way, but just sort of, to teach and lead the members of the union to vote and function politically in their own self-interest, in their class interest. Key word, class interest. So Labor Party advocates came along. The beginnings of it were actually the late 1980s. By 90, 91, Labor Party advocates had kind of come together as a network. And that's what it was. It was trade unionists primarily advocating the idea of a Labor Party. Well, folks today would remember this, but one of the devices we used, very, very legitimate devices, which I would say probably needs to be revived, was we used to go out, believe it or not, we'd go out and ask the members what they thought. Isn't this remarkable? We don't have to pay somebody to poll and focus group our members. No. We're going to go right to the union meetings, right to the rank and file, and ask some questions and then keep track of the answers. Well, the primary question, and I'm sure you, like me, I filled one of these out in the early stages. The questions, I'm paraphrasing, but I'm pretty close. It would say, do you as a working person feel that the two-party system represents your best interests? There were iterations of that. Well, let me tell you, even in the early 90s, gigantic majorities, if not absolute majorities and unanimous majorities of working people across dozens of unions, industrial sectors, blue collar, white collar, didn't matter. People said, absolutely not. This is the problem. Now, remember, this was the period where NAFTA was carving out and these unfair, employer-loaded trade agreements were just cutting entire industries out of the United States. So people were quite aware that this political action debacle that we had gotten ourselves into was really, the water was coming up to the door. And we did that survey. And then from that grew the beginnings of a party, a network, an actual membership, a political program. Remember, we had a whole program of what would the Labor Party actually stand for as opposed to run away from, and for all kinds of reasons, the party failed to take deep root, and it lasted, I think, 16, 17 years. But I think all of us that were involved in it can look back and say that was a high point in a very principled way and a very deep, in other words, it wasn't fluff. It was not fluff. It was the roots were deep in the places that we had them. But I think when I look back, and there's probably many different schools of thought, I mean, we did not know this, but we picked a very disastrous period of the U.S. labor movement to try to root something like this. And I think the fact that we still talk about it today and it comes up constantly is proof that this yet again will pop up again. I mean, we can't avoid this. This two-party trap, why do they call it a trap? It's a trap. If you don't struggle against it, you will go down the drain. If you are asleep or even don't recognize it, you'll be consumed by it. I mean, you're at the rate the working class is being devastated even today in now new and insidious ways. Where does this end? Does this end with all of us on all fours waiting to be shoved into the chutes? Is that where this ends? I mean, certainly look at corporate profits. We don't have a problem with corporate profits. Look at the war machine, the military intelligence world. I mean, look at all the structures that are just prospering. This SpaceX, this corporation has never generated a single profit. Here it is generating $1 trillion. And I mean, things are doing pretty good for the ruling elites. But look at the condition of the working class. It's appalling. And I think the Labor Party and the discussion of that, independence from the Democratic Party and independence from the Republican Party can't be ignored. It doesn't go away. It's sort of like that fly that the labor leadership would like to get that out of here. Well, I'm sorry. The condition of the working class, the condition of the members, the condition of the folks who should be members is so appalling. So I'm optimistic that it's not, I mean, I don't have any particular plan that for next week, but that survey needs to be revived because and maybe the final thing I'll say on this is that survey is what gave the local and national leaders of the unions. At a certain point, we had 13 national and international unions who would endorse the Labor Party, which was a pretty ambitious and a pretty gutsy thing. But it was based on the fact that they had worked with the party to survey hundreds, if not thousands of their members. And it was almost eye-opening for a lot of these folks because they were like, I never knew that my members really agreed on this. I didn't realize they saw it the same way that I did. All union leaders, it's politics. They're always, reluctant to get too far out front of their members. But when they saw where the huge majorities were of the members, then they ran to catch up.
Yeah,
I think we're lacking that today.
Yeah, I think that's right. I know, I was the chair of a committee in my local to investigate the Labor Party. And as I mentioned, we were in trusteeship. Eddie Cornegay from D.C. was the trustee. And, we talked to people. And at that time, Bill Clinton was president of the United States. He had a veto-proof our filibuster-proof majority in the Senate for Democrats and a majority in the House. And Labor wasn't really even asking for very much. I remember the anti-scab bill. You couldn't have permanent replacements because, as you mentioned, industry was leaving the country, and a lot of employers were also, forcing a strike, and then they would permanently replace the workers. And so we were trying to get, that was like the only thing they asked, and they didn't get it. They didn't get this little nothing. And
well, Richard, I'm going to blurt this out. Indulge my interruption. In 1995, when that legislation came to the Senate vote, it was known as S55, the Strikers' Rights Bill. And it was at the tail end of Lane Kirkland's tenure as the miserable, failed head of the AFL-CIO. It was before he was finally removed in a bit of a palace coup. But in any case, Bill Clinton was president. UE, our political action conference, was happening in Washington, D.C., and we picketed the Department of Labor. Now, if truth be known, we picketed the Department of Labor over the refusal of the Clinton administration to support that legislation. And frankly, we did it because anyone who's been to Washington, D.C. knows that the Department of Labor is only 2 blocks down the street from the Senate, where we needed to go and lobby. But the fact that we went there, I remember we had staffers, Clinton Labor Department staffers, pouring down the steps to grab me and grab the UE officers and beg us to stop picketing because we made them look bad.
Yep. Well, that was the point.
Remember this, everybody that sees Robert Reich, the guy that's trying to redeem himself and reinvent himself as some sort of a liberal.
Right. He was the Secretary of Labor. Yeah.
He did nothing. And UE did this, and we were commended by the labor movement. Well, the punchline to that story is the bill failed. It got fewer votes than the time it had been voted on when Bush was president. Bill Clinton couldn't deliver either one of the senators from his home state. And then the ultimate punchline was we discovered that Bill Clinton and Lane Kirkland flew to Geneva to attend the International Labor Organization meeting. Therefore, they were out of town. The vote went down, collapsed, lost. We haven't had a single piece of serious labor law reform legislation fought over like that one since then. And this was, here you go again. Labor leadership cooperating with Democrats to give them a fig leaf, to create optical illusions so that the members aren't any more angry with them. And
yeah, no, that's interesting. I mean, I know, here in Chicago at that time, it was, you mentioned the program that the Labor Party put out was bold and it stood for something in a way. And I remember we set up in a neighborhood a little bit north of where I live called Rogers Park. We set up we hope to be precinct operation eventually, because we were a party. We were hoping to get stuff going, and we would knock on doors. We had a program for everybody should be guaranteed a job at $10 an hour. This is in the mid 90s. So it would be higher than that now, and it would be adjusted for inflation. And we wanted that to be a constitutional amendment. And we had people going out and knocking on doors. And it was interesting because a lot of people were in, this is a working class neighborhood, and multinational. So it was like Latino, black, white, everything. But, people were influenced by just knocking on doors and talking, people that thought they knew everything politically would talk after knocking on a few doors. Because a lot of people thought the main piece of this was the guarantee of a job. But at that time, if people remember the 90s, or if you're around then, jobs, there was lots of jobs. The problem was they were low-paying part-time jobs with no benefits. And so people would have 2 or 3 jobs to try to get by. And so when you said guarantee a job, that didn't really ring with folks. But when you said $10 an hour, they're like, there you go. I'm for that, because most of them were working for, $5, $6, $7 an hour. I don't remember the minimum wage at that time, but it was in that area. And so we learned, and we started to develop actual organization that related to a national party that actually spoke to us, and unions were involved, and non-union people were involved too. So it was an interesting time.
Yeah, I'm going to say this, Richard. Let's come back to Virginia and the Abigail Spanberger, the whole disgrace with her vetoing the pro-union legislature. There's always been great interest amongst the state workforce, large as it is, to organize. Why? Look at the entry rates. The only upward movement that has happened in many sectors, and Virginia's state government would be one of them. The only upward movements that have come is because periodically the employer has to raise the wage or it can't attract anyone. These vacancies lay there for years and decades. This is how bad it's become. Human beings say, no, I can't get by on that. My kids can't get by on that. I'm not even going to bother to apply. A lot of other pathologies at play. But this is where we've come. And I come back, coming from the labor movement, being as rooted in the labor movement as I am, you are. This labor leadership has to start to lead.
Yeah.
It has to start to lead. This is a void of leadership. This is just a sad tailing behind a failed political party called the Democratic Party, and a disastrously failed one. Now with MAGA and the Republican Party having transformed itself into a violent juggernaut, repressive juggernaut against all that we stand for. So I think maybe it's beginning to sink in on folks that this party isn't even a credible defensive mechanism, which I'll say the AFL convention, it was lucky that it was in Minnesota because they were able to associate themselves with the heroic work done by tens of thousands of working people in Minnesota. But let's not examine too closely what the AFL actually encouraged and promoted and what else is coming. So again, it's this cheap optical illusion creation that they like to have, and it doesn't work. And time is running out. I mean, what's the next stage of this? We may see unions, arrested, banned, have their property seized. We've already seen tremendous attacks on our abilities to function. People have to look at this. The trade unions are greatly feared by the enemy because the enemy has a better grasp of what we could be than our so-called Democratic Party friends. That's remarkable when we come to that point.
Yeah, yeah. And well, let me ask you. I mean, in Minnesota at the AFL convention, one of the big things that happened there was the Service Employees International Union rejoined the AFL, and they'd famously split under Andy Stern, who was the president, and formed. They were the leaders of forming a federation called Change to Win, which collapsed, and. But SEIU is one of the largest unions in the United States. They spend an enormous amount of money on politics, maybe not political action as you would call it, but they spend a lot of money doing things that are politically related. How would you assess the SEIU and them joining the AFL? Is this a non-issue or do you see this as significant?
Well, I think it is what it is. For full disclosure, I was a member of SEIU in the 80s for several years. I was a very successful local organizer that they had in upstate New York. I'm well acquainted with SEIU, followed it ever since. Certainly a union large enough that it commands attention. But I don't see, I'll just bring it back to Virginia. SEIU played a major role here in Virginia and was equally confused at what happened with Spanberger. So I don't see them here having played any different role than the other unions. And it makes me wonder about sort of the maturity of its political program. And, I'm rooting for them like I'm rooting for practically every other union. But the question is, it has to be deeper. It has to be broader. The fact that they've returned to the AFL, well, perhaps they'll play a positive role. I mean, the talk on the street is that Rocio Sáenz will succeed Fred Redmond, the Secretary Treasurer. Fred Redmond was selected precisely because he is older, and he will retire at some point soon now that he's been reelected. This is part of the undemocratic culture of the AFL. Well, Sáenz may, in fact, be his successor. That's the chatter. Okay, perhaps that will pick up the pace a little bit of what's going on in the AFL-CIO. But by itself, I don't think it's, exactly what's needed. I mean, I was a close observer before and during and after the, just concluded AFL-CIO convention. And it's not necessarily what they did. It's what they didn't do, what they never addressed. And this question of never going to our members in any serious way and educating them to the realities of the class system, the class struggle, the balance of forces, this is disastrous.
Yeah.
This is disastrous.
Yeah.
I'll share a story from the Amalgamated Transit Union. There's probably some listeners here that know about that union, might even belong to it. When the January 6th events happened, when the MAGA mob stormed Congress, I was home. The organizing director for ATU. My mother and I watched it on TV. It was breathtaking. I sent an email to the president, the then and current president of the ATU, and said, his name's John Costa. And I said, John, you saw that on TV. What would we have done if this mob had been assaulting our headquarters? What would we have done? How many members around greater Washington, D.C. might we have mobilized? I will tell you, very, very few to come defend the headquarters. So I said to him, we need to engage and devise and engage a major, deep-seated political education program for this thing. And I volunteered in my own time because I had been the UE political director. By then, I was the organizing director. Well, to his credit, he called me the following day and he agreed with me. He agreed. But then he said, well, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to really build out our COPE program. This is the Dollars for Democrats program and a few dollars for Republicans. That's this, now,
For those that aren't in labor, it's a committee on political education that unions have as COPE.
This is a political donation so that you can get more money out of your members, because they're mostly Democrats. I mean, this was his entire solution. Well, and I have written about this. Anybody that follows my writings online, a website named Marxism, Leninism Today, anyone that glances at that, I did a review of their magazine just a couple months ago, the Amalgamated Transit Union magazine, which gets mailed to more than 200,000 homes in the U.S. and Canada. I read it cover to cover, and the word Trump did not appear a single time. Now, this is a disastrous malpractice to try to hide, and that repeats in many unions, trying to somehow, I refer to this as sort of the creep down in the tall weeds, and the Trumpzilla beast will somehow go by and destroy something else, and you'll escape that day at least. This is a contemptible leadership malpractice, if ever there was, and it needs to be confronted. I'm proud to confront it, but I think the members in the shops, in the union halls, can attest to this. Where is our educational campaign about what this is? How we ended up with Spanberger. We didn't even tell the members the truth about who she was and what was going to happen. Right? We just led them to believe this was going to float through into big success because she was a woman.
What would so if you were to design this, you wouldn't put COPE at the front of it. What would a Chris Townsend political education campaign, what would it look like? What would you be talking?
Very much, Richard, like the Labor Party program. It was a class-based, working class. It told the truth to the workers that the system is corrupt and rigged against the people at every turn, and that, yes, political action is necessary, first of all, as a defensive mechanism. Second of all, ultimately, sooner or later, an independent vehicle separate from the two parties is what's needed in order to make any advances. It was a very realistic, almost coldly so, because we didn't repeat the panacea, Pollyanna type nonsense. We didn't live on that. It was sort of like, sisters and brothers, let's look at the reality that we're all facing, where we've been, where we're going. I think and that's why you bring it up, Richard, when we look back to 30 years, everything we predicted and then some has come true, and it's all the bad stuff. It's really great when you predict good things and they come true, but when you predict bad things and an even worse comes true, well, don't blame me. Don't blame me.
Yes.
But that's exactly what we could say. Everyone involved in that Labor Party effort should be given a slap on the back and say, hey, you tried. You did what you could do at that time. But of course, the punchline I use throughout my work, none of us listening to this podcast are wealthy enough to give up.
Yeah.
So therefore, what are we going to do to put one foot in front of the other? Let's not fall into that miserable ignoramus trap of engaging in some kind of thought process that denies the class struggle or ignores it or doesn't look at the facts, has loyalty to the Democrats, as the primary goal and not the actual condition of the working class. I mean, we're down to brass tacks here. And I don't mind saying it. I mean, what are we waiting for? Are we waiting for what?
Yeah.
Or worse than this?
Well, let me ask you about, larger and larger sections of the working class in the United States are people of color. And you've alluded, and Trump uses racism more and more and more, or more than people that have come before him, more overtly anyways. And you've talked about, in this episode, about repression or potential repression coming our way. And I wanted to ask you about specifically, the Supreme Court has reversed the Voting Rights Act, or it's been repealed, and the Supreme Court has made some decisions. The gerrymandering, between censuses, and the efforts to really eliminate the ability of working class Black people, especially, but others, to have their votes, to be able to vote, have their votes count, and to be represented in any significant way. How does that change our calculus, in your view, going forward?
Yeah. I think take the Supreme Court, for example. What is this? What is this so-called Supreme Court? It's a piece that comes down from medieval times, if not even maybe further than that, back to Roman time. Look at the building that they operate in. It's made to look like it's part of ancient Rome. This is to create this reverential feeling that somehow these supremes in there are these supreme arbiters of all questions. This is one of the most fundamentally anti-democratic pieces, so long overdue for abolishment, it's not even funny or reworking. So I think the Supreme Court stands as a great example of a legalistic defense of private property is what it is. All things have to be measured in terms of defending the ruling elites, the wealthy, the owner class, and whatnot, and that we've made great strides fighting and pushing back against it. But as long as it exists, and as long as we have a Supreme Court that has issued opinions like money is free speech in an era of trillionaires, it doesn't work any longer. And I've written about this. I think those of us on the left have to seriously consider, have we reached the point where reformism is unrealistic? I don't really like that. I don't like to contemplate that. But if we're scientifically weighing it, how do you somehow outweigh a trillionaire or a whole bevy, a shipload of trillionaires who are purchasing? And look at today's Supreme Court. It's got to be the most, and this is saying something over the history of our Supreme Court. It's got to be one of the most bought and paid for, outright corrupt, pay for play type courts that we've seen in all of our lifetime. So do we really want to just reform that? Do we really just want to dust that off a little bit and it'll function a little bit? No, abolish it. I think we're being driven as working class people. We're being driven, I hope, to the not the right conclusions, but what I would call the left conclusions, which is some of these things have to give way. And you know, there's an old adage, I don't know who did it. It might have been Daniel De Leon, the foremost early Marxist in the United States. He said that, and it may not have been his original thought, but that's where I saw it first. But he said, you know, if a social crisis arises and it can't move forward, reaction is the alternative. And this is exactly what we're dealing with. Our Democratic Party stands in the way. How do I demonstrate the fact of that? People know this. Bernie Sanders probably would have been president if the entire officialdom of the Democratic Party had not figured out how to, you know, sabotage him. And that's not to say that Bernie Sanders was a revolutionary figure, but he was a militantly reformist figure. But there you go. Again and again and again in history, we see the democratic machinery standing in the way of progress. And what have we got now? We've had a huge reaction. Because if the left does not speak, if the labor movement and the left, of which they're intertwined, if they don't speak to workers and lead workers, somebody else will.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what we're seeing. So think about that.
Yeah.
You know, if a social crisis arises, and look, we're polluted with social crisis. If it can't resolve itself, if it can't move forward, reaction is and I think that's a truism that I've you know, and I think we're there with this. So I say to folks, you know, you may not have hard left impulses, but if you listen to your head a little bit more than you listen to your heart, you will see that we can't reason with these elements anymore. You know, try reasoning with these ICE, you know, goon squads and death squads. And I'll say this is horrible to say, but what we had just two that we know of that were killed in Minneapolis, the sister and the brother. They were both killed. There's been no prosecution of those ICE folks. There won't be. And both were shot in the head.
Yeah.
That's an assassin. That's someone trained. You know, so, I mean, I could go on and on with this. Our worst fears are coming true. I'll ring that bell as loudly as I can. I know you do, Richard, and the listeners need to do that. We're not going to beg and plead and reform these elements. A showdown is coming. It's here. And we have to play our role. and go to the working class. It really, this coming years is going to separate the wheat from the chaff and the dilettantes in our movement. And it doesn't make them bad people. But we need, this is that old thing. Little children sometimes believe fantastic things because they're little children. We have to cease thinking like little children. We have to cease thinking that CIA agents who are orchestrated into the governor's seat in the state of Virginia are somehow there to help us liberate the working class. No, that's childish thinking. That's irresponsible in the extreme. That's almost putting it very mildly. It's more sinister than that, we know, but we have to challenge ourselves. And I say to folks, look left, look left.
Yeah, that's a great way to end the episode here. Is there anything else that we haven't covered here that you'd like to add at this time, Chris?
Well, only I would just encourage folks, talk to each other, but most of all, talk to the unorganized. I think our movement has always suffered from this sort of, in the family type discussion. Talk to unorganized workers, go out. It will be a big morale boost because for everyone that you find who is unhinged, you'll find 75 who are frankly with us, but they either don't know about us or they don't read the public, never heard of the publications. Share this video, share Richard's show, the Fight Back News, share it, sit, as I will. And build the traffic of these things. Do your work. None of this is going to happen by happenstance or, spontaneously. We have to accept our role, do what we can do. Everybody can play a part. Join your union, strengthen your union, join a left organization, join a socialist organization. Just do it. I mean, this is not a drill. It's here. Everything that we might have worried about 10 and 30 years ago is happening. And then some. And I can't put it any stronger. Again, none of us are rich enough to give up. If you are, God bless you for listening to this. Make a large donation.
Make a large donation
to Fight Back Radio so that Richard can multiply a hundredfold what's going on. I'm deadly serious about this. This is, if not now, when?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And thank you for being our guest. We're going to put in the show notes a couple of your articles from ML Today so people can read those. And then people should read, of course, fightbacknews.org as well. But thank you so much for being our guest on Fight Back Radio. Okay, so Chris Townsend gives us some good advice here and some good insight. Be bold with our class politics, our class demands when we're going into the electoral field. And nothing else has really worked for us. And the fact that our class enemies are constantly trying to crush us shouldn't make us be weak or mealy-mouthed, but make us be bold and to really try to organize around real class demands. And that's worked to some degree at times. I mean, this electoral business is difficult, and so it's set up to be difficult, and they've succeeded at that. As my friend Frank Chapman says, when people say the system isn't working, he says, no, it's working exactly the way it's designed. So it's designed to screw us and make them good ahead. I want to, before we go off the air here today, I want to encourage people to get involved in a Pride, march in a Pride parade, hold a Pride event, do something. June is Pride Month, and we want to celebrate our diversity, celebrate our LGBTQ friends. So I hope you're able to do that. As we're airing this, we just passed the Juneteenth Day weekend, and I hope people had a chance to celebrate that as well. I encourage you to read about Juneteenth Day to figure out, what happened here and why, the question of slavery ending and what was going on in Texas at that time. Those are all interesting subjects. Similarly, I'd encourage people to read about the Pride movement and the LGBTQ movement and their fights for equality, and especially now because Trump's attacks on LGBTQ and all diversity, equity, and inclusion, and probably especially trans people, voting rights for Black people and others, as we talked about in the episode with Chris. All these things need us to push back. We're heading towards 250 years since the Declaration of Independence, And so I think it's about time that working class people demand freedom as well. So I wanted to say those things. And then I want to thank our person that does our music, Andy Koch, who does the intro and the outro. And I want to also thank, as always, our entire production team, Frank Narwat, Caetano Silvera, Lane Dorsey, Dodd McColgan, Shane Tremley, and I'm Richard Berg for the entire Fight Back Radio team, saying until next time, all power to the people.